All right, good morning. Chuck Hyde here, Vistage Chair here in Northwest Arkansas, and I'm pleased to be joined today by a fellow chair and colleague, Greg Bustin, who is a Vistage Chair down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Greg, good morning.
Good morning, Chuck.
Greg, I'll introduce you here in just a second, but you and I have known each other for a couple of years now in our roles and our contact in the region that is the Dallas region through Vistage, and you're going to be coming to our groups in July, talking about accountability, which I'm really excited about. It's something that every group needs. But you've also been doing some work on decision making here recently, and that's what I really want to focus on today. It is something, Greg, we inherently do as leaders. It just comes with the roles that we're in. But we find ourselves, in where we find ourselves today, and where I believe we're headed. I don't think there's anything more important that we can talk about in a time like this for leaders in terms of how we make good, solid decisions and the implications that come with that. So excited to focus on that today. Greg, you are, in addition to being a Vistage Chair, you have your own consulting practice. You've been doing management consulting and marketing work for years. You've been 15 years as a Vistage Chair, earning the title of Master Chair, which is a big deal in our circles. You've also spent 12 years as a speaker, so you've seen and done a lot, and just really appreciate your opportunity to spend time today. So I want to thank you again for making time, and I always want to start with the reality of where we've been and how it affects people, because it affects all of us in every way. And so, how are you? How have you been impacted personally by the COVID-19 crisis? And just give us a check in there.
Well, thanks, Chuck, and thanks again for inviting me. It's great to be on the show with you, and I am looking forward to the July trip, because I believe it will be my first back live in person.
Hey, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Since this has gone down, I've given about 20 of these workshops via Zoom, and that's one way that things have been impacted. We're all safe. Our little neighborhood in Dallas had the distinction at one point for being the hotbed of COVID in Dallas County, and we came out of that all okay. The month of May has been special for us. I think we all are getting back in touch with what really matters. You kind of jettison the unimportant and trivial, and get really dialed in. So in the month, our daughter and son-in-law made the move down. They've still got their apartment in Chicago, but they wanted to get out of the cold, get out of downtown, and come place where they could see sunshine and be able to get out. So in the month of May, we've celebrated four things. We celebrated my birthday, their first wedding anniversary, Mother's Day, and our son-in-law's 30th birthday. So it's been a great way to reconnect that way and to celebrate some important milestones.
That's great. Well, I love those stories, and yeah, you're right. There's a lot of us that are finding that the circumstance we find ourselves in and the people we're around creating opportunities that we probably wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that's just a huge takeaway. And so in the rush back to normal, we had a quote in the rush back to normal, think about which parts of normal are worth rushing back to.
Right. That's good.
And then what parts of what we've been experiencing are worth holding on to, I think is the flip side of that coin. And so hopefully we'll all be able to practice some of that. So Greg, I want to turn to this whole topic of decision making. You released a book recently, How Leaders Decide. And when you began to share this project with us, I was really curious. I know you researched 25,000 historical events, selecting 52 that kind of have the most spectacular failures and achievements in decision making throughout history. And I want to spend some time, first of all, just what did you learn from that process, and what is it highlighting about the importance of decision making?
Well, I'll give you my secret. I Googled this day in history for all 365 days, and something's happening right every day. And I think one of the things that we can take away from this is that we know that leadership has never been more important in any kind of a crisis. And certainly these things that I eventually chose for the book. They had to be the biggest, the first, most at risk, touching the most lives. And so while the recall of Tylenol was certainly huge, and that was a big decision because many predicted the brand would not survive when they made that decision. It lost out to the Cuban Missile Crisis because we might not be doing this if that had gone another way. And so I was looking for those kinds of things. And what it really, the second thing that it spoke to me, Chuck, is that as leaders, not only are we making decisions, and that decision making has never been more important, but there is something that's going to happen. There is going to be a decision that somebody makes, maybe not today, maybe not next week, but there is an opportunity to make history. I mean, the people that I found were, in most cases, these were ordinary people who thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and they made decisions that changed the trajectory of history. And so that I think is what makes this compelling reading. I think leaders love history because it's based on fact and it's real. And so really what I tried to do in this was to create 3 different sets of questions around each of these 52 events that would speak to leaders today about how they reflect on their own leadership styles, how they decide, how they make a decision, and things of that nature.
That, so if I build on this, why leaders like history? I mean, we talk all the time. History repeats itself, and maybe that's something that maybe is beginning to show itself in some of these decisions, right? The scaffolding, which we'll talk about here in a minute. It's that this process and find ourselves. The circumstances are changing all the time, but there's I would imagine some consistency and commonality in terms of how people are making these decisions, kind of what goes into it.
Correct. I mean, people talk about this pandemic as being unprecedented, and in many ways that is entirely true. But in other ways, history has repeated itself because we got through polio. I mean, I remember as a kid lining up in my elementary school in Austin, Texas, to get vaccinated for polio, and that at the time was the biggest scare since the bubonic plague. Millions of people all over the world died. It took 36 years for Jonas Salk to find the vaccine, and fingers crossed that our doctors are on this sooner. But when you think about that, and you think about the decisions to inoculate, to fast track a drug, and essentially using school kids as human guinea pigs, which is almost unthinkable today. And yet you say, okay, who would step up and do that? And certainly I know we've both seen, folks that have what looks to be maybe terminal diseases, and you say, hey, I'm willing to raise my hand to do some, take some medication that might be on the bleeding edge of technology, because what do I have to lose? And that was a lot of what was happening back in the 60s when the polio vaccine was eventually discovered. So yeah, there is a lot of repeating here. And I think that's one of the takeaways for leaders to say, okay, wow, when I ponder a question, and we can get into what some of those might be, but it's like, here's a question. It's like, hey, what's an unpopular decision that I've got to make today that I know is probably the right decision, but it's going to upset a number of people? And these leaders had to make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, Greg, you're talking about, to me, impact. You alluded to it earlier, and just whether it's the Tylenol example or the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Huge impact. I mean, that is the stuff of making history. And when I speak to young leaders, I know you did an emerging leader session earlier this week, but whether it's early career or student, I'm always talking about, so you want to be a leader? Well, let's talk about what comes with that.
Right.
And it's this responsibility. So, and we don't always know. You've been talking about the story behind the story in your book, but let's talk about that and sort of this whole idea of scaffolding that supports the decision-making process. Describe for us that scaffolding concept and why it's so important, because I think that's the part that transfers itself to this unprecedented event and the ones that are waiting on us, down the road.
Right. Well, two quick stories behind the stories. These are two of my favorites. Well, I'll give you three quick ones. One is we look at the Titanic disaster, which is still to this day the largest maritime disaster in history. And we look not at the date that it hit the iceberg, but at the date 27 months prior, when certain decisions were made as it related to the design of the ship, the materials that were used, the number of lifeboats, all those sorts of things that had different decisions been made. Maybe the loss of life, maybe the ship might not even have sunk, and maybe even if it had sunk, the loss of life would not have been as great. The second story behind the story, Martin Luther King almost didn't say, "I have a dream," right? He was encouraged to say he had prepared remarks, and he put them away. And I think that's one of the things, for leaders to say, look, we've got to be prepared, but we need to know when to speak from the heart, right? And that's what made that speech so powerful. And then, a piece of history that I had no clue even existed until I dug into this. I mean, it was a little bit like a sort of a detective. I felt like a detective, because one event would lead me to another event, and I uncovered a woman that I had never heard of, Mary Edwards Walker, who still to this day is the only female Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. And what did she do? And really, it was really a life of selflessness that earned her that distinction. And so, when you talk about the scaffolding, the book does not really provide a prescription for leaders. Rather, it's a framework for thinking. And so, one of the things that I have found is that it's important for leaders to understand that how the decision gets made is almost as important as the decision itself. Are you collaborative? Are you strategic? Do you have a bias for action? It's like, you may decide, but can you pull the trigger, right? And so those are elements to think about. One of the things in my research that I was interested to find is that only 15% of leaders, 15% of the time, do they ever consider a second option. I mean, part of the challenge of being a leader is that you really need to know what you stand for, but you've got to have some humility to maybe look at things from a different perspective, or to bring in others, or to know when to ask for help. And I think that's one of the great things about Vistage, is that the best members that we have, they have a very strong point of view on things, and yet they know that they are in this environment where others have strong points of view and other life experiences, and they know that it could be valuable to consider those. And so the part of the scaffolding is really to understand that decision making, it can be approached as brainstorming, but it's better when it's approached as a discovery. Because brainstorming ideas, you've got about a flip of the coin likelihood of having it be right or wrong. But when you go on a journey of discovery, then you are essentially codifying your decision-making process. And so one of the things that I've developed, and I'm actually in talks with my publisher about, is adding a tool that I have developed. The book was published last year, and I just continue to study this whole decision-making area. I've developed what I call a decision grid. And the grid is, here are 10 questions that you have to ask and answer before you make a decision. But the problem with asking a question, which as a chair, is that it leads you to a whole bunch of other questions. And so the way the grid is organized is, the very first question is, what are the facts? Well, that prompts 7 or 8 other questions that you move, and then ultimately, so I call it the quest, the path, the discovery. And the discovery column is blank because that's yours to discover. So I could not be predictive or prescriptive on how to tell you to make a decision, but I do believe that this scaffolding provides some guidance that you can use some of the things that matter most to you, including your core values. That is a piece of the scaffolding.
Right.
You know what you stand for, because a lot of these things could go either way, but it really is a matter of, you know, your personal value, your character, your integrity on, you know, what you think is the right thing to do. And I think for leaders, the decisions that bubble up to our level, you know, that's when the stakes are highest. It's when the most people are affected, and a lot of times it really comes down to a matter of what's right and wrong, not what is intellectually correct.
Yeah, yeah. And well, what I'm thinking about, Greg, is that in this discovery process, there's a real discipline to that. One of the things that I talk to our members about, and even some candidates, as they think about, well, do I even want to be a part of Vistage Group? It's not that people in Vistage are incapable of making a decision. They're all smart. They're all successful. They all run great companies. They just want to make better decisions through this process of discovery, right? That there's a discipline to, and kind of checking that ego that you mentioned a little bit, to say, I'm gonna work my way through a way of thinking and how I make this decision, and have people speak into me in that regard. So thanks for that.
Let me just add, I think part of what gets leaders to a certain place is their ability to assess what's going on and move quickly to a fix. But a lot of times that also can get them into trouble. And so this, you know, most people, frankly, are not trained to make decisions. They just end up having made more good ones than not. And as you say, it generally is not a matter of, you know, are they not smart enough or forceful enough or whatever. It's, hey, am I discerning enough to know when to speed things up, slow things down, when to listen to somebody else, and when to all see it.
Well, you know, Greg, it's, you know, we're almost 3 months into this whole time in our country where the world just, when the world got turned upside down, began to affect us here in the States. Maybe is the way to think about that. And so when we thought about decision making 90 days ago, it had a certain context to it. It certainly had context as we've gone through the early phases of the COVID-19 impact. But I think, again, I really believe in where we're headed has a ton of implications in terms of how we approach decision making. So maybe give our members a bit of insight, and compare, contrast what decision making looks like in and out of crisis, and how it's going to matter for us as we emerge from this. What should our leaders understand?
Well, President Kennedy may be the one who got credit for this thousands of years later, after the Chinese already knew about it. But the symbol for crisis and opportunity are made up of the same characters. And so what's going on right now is that for every opportunity to crater, there's an opportunity to step up and reimagine what opportunities we have before us. And I think that from a leadership standpoint, I think it's important to remember that people, number one, that people want to be led. They want to be, they are looking for leaders, right? And the best leaders, number two, understand that people, they want information, they want validation, they are expecting a plan. And so it's up to the leaders to be able to provide that. And as I said, how that plan comes together, is it autocratic? Is it collaborative? You know, that's important as well. As part of this, I think there is a lot of communication, Chuck, that is wrapped up in this. And as I have gone back, and I have in the last 60 days, and I mean, you can just search for the top 10 speeches in history that have ever been given. And you know what? The vast majority of those were given during times of crisis. Yeah. The reason that they have been imprinted on people's minds, the Gettysburg Address, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, in the time of the race crisis of the 60s, Kennedy's Cuban Missile speech, and in his declaration, we choose to go to the moon. I mean, he made some great speeches. Ask me, right? If you look at those, FDR, the only thing that we have is fear itself. Leaders are great communicators. And one of the things that I think is very important right now is to remind ourselves that people can handle the truth when they know you have their best interests at heart. So don't try to sugarcoat things. Give me the truth. And these leaders had this uncanny knack of telling people the really somber truth. I mean, Churchill's, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He said, we are in for a long and difficult struggle. And yet the way he said it, and by giving them a plan and giving them something that they could contribute, has this uncanny knack of lifting people up, of giving them hope and courage. And I think that that's what people are looking for. And then lastly, I would just say is this is not a time to be, you've got to be discerning enough to know when to slow things down, but there's a time for debate and there's a time to act. And I think you make your decision and you move on, and then you can adjust accordingly. Years ago, one of the executives that I interviewed for my accountability book said, there are very few irreversible decisions. In some cases, there were, and we talk about some of those in the book, but most of the time, let's do something. I mean, even Roosevelt said, right, there are a million ways of going forward and only one way of standing still. So it's this idea that, we have got to show some urgency and decisiveness.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. It's very consistent with what I'm hearing from our members, Greg, in terms of what some people are, they're seeing competitors almost paralyzed by, and which results in that being standing still. And then this ability to adjust. I mean, I read an article this morning out of Forbes and was just talking about decision making, and it almost made it read like there was a single decision. And I would offer, like you just said, I mean, it's a decision with the best information you have, with the best motive and interest outcome, with an ability to hold that fairly loosely so that as things change, you can pivot, right?
Yep.
And have enough agility. And I love this list of speeches that you mentioned. And, we started this whole conversation around history. And, we look back in history in times of crisis. I think you make a great point about why it matters and the hope and courage our leaders can offer to the people we're leading as we make these decisions and where we find ourselves. So thank you for that.
Well, Napoleon said a leader is a dealer in hope. And there's that. And people want to believe that it can be done. And the best leaders don't lie to people. They tell them that it's going to be tough, but they also impart their personal conviction and belief that we can get this thing done. We can move forward. There are opportunities here, and that's the kind of it's not false hope, and it's not just bravado. If you go back, as I did yesterday, I listened to Kennedy's "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech. He gave very specific, what this is going to cost, how it's going to work. I know it's a lot of money. But I mean, the reputation of the United States, I mean, we were like this with Russia, and we were in a race, and race was how we were measuring superiority during the Cold War. And this was a race that had to be run. It was a race that had to be won. And you listen to that conviction that comes through from Kennedy, and he's like, look, I know all the doubts. I know how hard this is going to be. We're going to be using materials that haven't even been invented yet. And I know that this is going to cost a lot of money, but it's about 50 cents a day, which is more than most people spend on cigarettes.
Well, Greg, and I think this, for anybody listening, sitting here thinking, I'm not Lincoln, I'm not Dr. King, I'm not Kennedy, I'm not FDR, I'm not Churchill, I'm not even Napoleon, I'm not any of these people. It doesn't matter, right? When you go back to what you said earlier, is that people can you make people give them hope and courage, and they can handle the truth when they know you've got their interest, your shared interest, at the forefront of what you're trying to do. So I think any of us can do that.
And I will tell you one thing, and this entry is not in the book, but I'm going to write something about it because her birthday is coming up, and that is Anne Frank. And Frank was a little Dutch girl, and she made a decision that she was going to write, and she left a diary behind that has been translated into 70 languages and inspired millions of people. And it was published, of course, posthumously. But that's just an everyday person. And I think that there are examples like that of everyday people. And that's why I believe when we know what we stand for and we know what we want and we know what we're good at, that also helps us understand who needs to be on our team. And it can also serve as our compass point to help us maintain true north while we are making these really tough decisions.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thanks so much. I mean, this is obviously a ton of information, but I just want to thank you because I think there's it's not only informative, it's inspiring in terms of where our leaders need to be thinking about and what we can draw from history and how we go forward and how we lead in the times we find ourselves. I know you don't want to self-promote, but I want you to tell us where people can find the book. Again, talk about and any other resources and how to find you, because I know you're out in the public doing projects and strategy and those kinds of things. So where can people find more?
Well, my two most popular books are Accountability and How Leaders Decide. Both are available through Amazon, and so you can do that. I've got a ton of tools and blogs and exercises on my website, which is bustin.com, bustin.com. And come on in, sign up for my monthly newsletter. Join the 10,000 other people who are reading stuff, and help yourself to some free tools.
Well, Greg, thanks so much for the time, the input again. Continued safety for you and your family in this time of being able to be together and celebrate, continue maybe some more milestones and time together. And again, fingers crossed that you will be with us on the ground in Northwest Arkansas in July. And we'll look at each other in our continued chair practices as well.
Very good, Chuck. Thanks again for inviting me.
You bet. Talk soon.
All right.